The wind that sweeps across the steppes of Central Asia has always carried the whispers of empires rising and falling, but in the spring of 1220, it carried something far more terrifying. It carried the scent of smoke, the metallic tang of blood, and the thunderous rhythm of hundreds of thousands of hooves beating against the earth. To the people of the Khwarezmian Empire, a sprawling superpower that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, the horizon was no longer a boundary of possibility, but a closing jaw of doom. They were about to witness the collision of two worlds, a cataclysm that would alter the genetic and geopolitical map of Eurasia forever. At the center of this storm sat Samarkand, the glittering jewel of the Silk Road, a city of turquoise domes and impregnable walls, waiting for a force that history would come to know as the Scourge of God. This was not merely a battle, it was the systematic dismantling of a civilization, executed with a cold, terrifying precision that defies the chaotic nature of war. This is the story of how the Mongols, under the banner of Genghis Khan, broke the spine of Persia. To understand the tragedy of Samarkand, one must first understand the titans involved. On one side stood the Khwarezmian Empire, led by Shah Muhammad II. He was a man who styled himself as a second Alexander, a conqueror who had expanded his realm through ruthlessness and ambition. His empire was wealthy, sophisticated, and heavily militarized. His cities were centers of learning and trade, boasting libraries, observatories, and irrigation systems that turned the arid landscape into blooming gardens. His army was vast, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, composed of heavily armored cavalry, Turkic mercenaries, and war elephants brought up from the Indian frontier. On paper, the Shah was the most powerful monarch in the Islamic world, perhaps even the world. Opposite him stood a force that the settled world had not yet learned to comprehend. The Mongols were often dismissed by the urban elites of Persia as mere barbarians, a rabble of nomads distinct only for their savagery. This underestimation was the first and most fatal error. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongol tribes had been forged into a military machine of terrifying efficiency. They were not a horde in the sense of a disorganized mob. They were a disciplined army organized on a decimal system, capable of complex maneuvers communicated by flags and lanterns in the heat of battle. They possessed a mobility that no feudal army could match, capable of covering vast distances with spare mounts, living off the land, and striking where they were least expected. But perhaps most importantly, they brought with them a corps of Chinese siege engineers, men who knew the secrets of gunpowder, ballistics, and mechanics, turning the Mongols from unparalleled field warriors into master besiegers. The spark that ignited this inferno was not originally a desire for conquest, but a diplomatic insult that spiraled into total war. Genghis Khan had initially sought trade with his neighbor to the west. He sent a caravan laden with goods and a message of goodwill, acknowledging the Shah as the ruler of the west while he ruled the east. But the governor of the border city of Otrar, driven by greed and suspicion, seized the goods and executed the merchants. When Genghis sent 3 ambassadors to demand justice, the Shah, in a display of hubris that would doom millions, shaved the beards of 2 and beheaded the 3rd. In the Mongol code, the person of an ambassador was sacrosanct. This was not a political slight. It was a declaration of existential war. The Khan went to the top of a sacred mountain, bared his head to the sky, and prayed for 3 days, descending with a single mandate: vengeance. The invasion that followed was a masterclass in strategic warfare. The Shah, fearing that his own commanders might turn on him if he concentrated his massive army in one place, made the catastrophic decision to disperse his forces. He garrisoned them in the major cities, Otrar, Bukhara, and Samarkand, believing that the Mongols would exhaust themselves trying to crack these fortresses one by one. He expected a traditional war of attrition. What he got was a lightning strike that bypassed his defenses and struck at the heart of his dominion. Genghis Khan split his army. While one force tied down the border garrisons, another, led by the Khan himself, did the impossible. They crossed the Kizilkum Desert, a wasteland thought impassable by an army, and emerged behind the Khwarezmian defensive lines. The psychological impact of this maneuver cannot be overstated. Suddenly, the Mongols were not just at the border, they were deep inside the empire, cutting off lines of communication and supply. Bukhara fell first. The city was sacked, its inhabitants scattered, and the survivors driven forward as human shields, a grim tactic that would become a hallmark of the campaign. As the Mongol war machine turned its gaze toward Samarkand, the refugees from the countryside poured into the city, bringing with them tales of horror that sapped the morale of the defenders before the first arrow was even loosed. Samarkand was a fortress of immense strength. Its walls were high and thick, reinforced with towers and surrounded by a deep moat. Inside, the Shah had stationed a garrison of over 100,000 men, including his elite cavalry and 20 war elephants, beasts that were intended to trample the smaller Mongol ponies. The city was well stocked, capable of withstanding a siege for years. The citizens believed they were safe. They believed that the sheer scale of their defenses would break the Mongol wave. But as the dust clouds on the horizon grew thicker, blocking out the sun, that confidence began to waver. The Mongol arrival was methodical. They did not rush the walls in a frenzy. They arrived in formation, encircling the city with a suffocating embrace. The noise would have been deafening. The drums, the horns, the chanting of the warriors, and the terrifying silence that fell when the orders were given. Genghis Khan set up his command post, observing the defenses with the eye of a wolf studying a trapped stag. He knew that a direct assault on such fortifications would be costly, so he employed a strategy of psychological warfare and tactical deception. The first phase of the battle for Samarkand involved the prisoners. Thousands of captives from Bukhara and the surrounding villages were forced to march ahead of the Mongol lines, pushing siege engines and filling the moats with bundles of wood and earth. The defenders on the walls were faced with a horrific choice: hold their fire and allow the enemy to approach, or slaughter their own countrymen. It was a calculation designed to break the spirit of the garrison, to show them that their enemy possessed a cruelty that knew no bounds. Amidst this chaos, the Mongol engineers set to work. Giant catapults and trebuchets, technologies adapted from the wars in China, began to rain stone and fire upon the city. Naphtha pots created infernos that water could not extinguish, spreading panic through the wooden structures within the walls. Despite the bombardment, the garrison of Samarkand was strong. On the third day of the siege, the defenders launched a massive sortie. The gates swung open and the Khwarezmian cavalry surged out, led by the war elephants. This was the moment the Shah's generals had pinned their hopes on. They believed that, in open combat, their heavy armor and superior numbers would crush the light Mongol horsemen. The sight must have been majestic and terrifying. Thousands of armored riders thundering across the plain, the ground shaking under the weight of the elephants. But the Mongols were expecting this. In the lexicon of steppe warfare, the feigned retreat is the oldest and most effective trick. Yet time and again, disciplined armies fell for it. As the Khwarezmians charged, the Mongol center broke. They turned their horses and fled, loosing arrows over their shoulders as they rode. The defenders, sensing victory, broke their formation and gave chase, drawn further and further away from the safety of the walls. They were lured into a kill zone, a pre-selected terrain where the Mongol flanks were waiting in ambush. Suddenly the retreat stopped. The Mongol heavy lancers, the Kashik, wheeled around. From the ridges and the tall grass, fresh tumens of horse archers appeared, closing the trap. The Khwarezmian cavalry found themselves surrounded. The mobile Mongol archers rode in circles, a tactic known as the caracole, pouring a relentless rain of armor-piercing arrows into the chaotic mass of men and beasts. The war elephants, stuck with arrows and panicked by the noise and fire, ran amok, trampling their own troops and shattering the cohesion of the sortie. What began as a counterattack turned into a massacre. The flower of the Samarkand garrison was cut down in the open field, their bodies forming a carpet of steel and flesh leading back to the city gates. Inside the city, the mood shifted from defiance to despair. The failure of the sortie had stripped the city of its most aggressive defenders. The walls were still manned, but the heart had gone out of the resistance. It was at this breaking point that the political fragility of the Khwarezmian Empire was exposed. The garrison was composed largely of Turkic mercenaries, men who shared a cultural and linguistic heritage with the Mongols. Seeing the writing on the wall, and perhaps hoping for preferential treatment, the leaders of the Turkic contingent opened secret negotiations with Genghis Khan. They offered to surrender the city in exchange for their lives. Genghis Khan accepted their surrender. The gates of Samarkand were thrown open. The Turkic mercenaries rode out, expecting to be incorporated into the Mongol army, as was the custom in steppe warfare when tribes merged. But Genghis Khan was not building a tribal confederation here. He was exacting punishment. He viewed these men not as long-lost cousins, but as traitors to their salt. If they would betray the Shah who paid them, they would betray the Khan tomorrow. In one of the grimest episodes of the war, the 30,000 Turkic soldiers were separated from the civilians, surrounded, and systematically executed. It was a cold, brutal message. Loyalty was the only currency the Khan valued. And these men were bankrupt. With the garrison neutralized, the city of Samarkand lay naked before the conquerors. The Mongols entered on the 5th day. The population was ordered to gather in the plain outside the city walls. They were told to bring their valuables, a command that usually preceded looting. The citizens, terrified and obedient, emptied their homes. The artisans and craftsmen, the weavers, the smiths, the potters, were separated from the crowd. These were the human capital the Mongols prized. They would be sent east to Mongolia to serve the empire. The young men were selected for the levies, to serve as human shields for the next siege. The rest of the population, the old, the infirm, the unnecessary, were left to the mercy of soldiers who had been promised plunder. The sacking of Samarkand was absolute. The great mosque, a symbol of the city's piety, was torched. The citadel, where a few die-hard defenders still held out, was flooded when the Mongols diverted the water channels, undermining the walls and drowning those trapped inside. The intricate irrigation canals that fed the city's gardens were smashed, turning the fertile oasis back into a dust bowl. This was not just looting, it was the erasure of a habitat. The Mongols did not intend to occupy Samarkand as a capital, they intended to leave it as a graveyard. While the city burned, the architect of this disaster, Shah Muhammad II, was a fugitive in his own land. He had fled west, chased by two of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, Jibi and Subutai. These dogs of war, as the Khan called them, pursued the Shah with the tenacity of hunting hounds. They tore through Persia, shattering local armies that tried to intervene, their only goal to capture the monarch. The Shah, once the ruler of millions, died destitute and alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea, likely of pneumonia, wearing rags. It was a pathetic end to a reign that had promised so much. His son, Jalal al-Din, would fight on valiantly for years, becoming a thorn in the Mongol side. But the empire itself died at Samarkand. The destruction of Samarkand in 1220 serves as a grim focal point for the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. It showcased the terrifying duality of the Mongol war machine, the unparalleled tactical brilliance on the battlefield and the calculated, almost industrial application of terror off of it. The fall of the city sent shockwaves through the medieval world. It signaled the end of the Islamic Golden Age in Central Asia. The libraries were burned, the scholars killed or enslaved, and the trade routes that had funneled wealth into the region were disrupted for decades. But from a military perspective, the siege and battle were a masterpiece of combined arms. The Mongols effectively utilized espionage to understand their enemies' political weaknesses. They used strategic mobility to outmaneuver a numerically superior force. They employed engineering to overcome fortifications that should have been impregnable. And they used psychology, terror, deception, and the manipulation of hope to break the enemy's will to fight. The total war simulation of this battle often highlights the clash of units, the heavy lancers against the horse archers, the elephants against the siege engines. But the reality was that the battle was won before the first sword was swung. It was won in the planning, in the discipline, and in the ruthless clarity of Genghis Khan's vision. The aftermath of Samarkand changed the demographics of the region. The depopulation was so severe that some historians argue the region never fully recovered its pre-1220 population levels until the modern era. The intricate Qanat water systems, which required constant maintenance by a large workforce, collapsed without plea to tend them, leading to the desertification of once fertile lands. The cultural center of gravity in the Islamic world shifted west, away from the ravaged east. Yet, in the ashes of destruction, a new order eventually emerged. The Pax Mongolica would later reopen the trade routes, allowing for an unprecedented exchange of goods and ideas between Europe and Asia. But for the people of Samarkand in 1220, there was no future, only the dust and the sword. The story of this battle is a testament to the fragility of civilization. It reminds us that walls, no matter how high, and armies, no matter how vast, are no guarantee against a force that rewrites the rules of engagement. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of the citadel, the Mongols did not linger. They watered their horses, packed their yurts, and turned their gaze to the next horizon, to the next city, to the next conquest. They left behind a silence where once there had been the bustle of a metropolis. It is a silence that still echoes in the history books, a reminder of the year the steppe descended upon the city and the world changed forever. The legacy of the Mongol conquest of Persia is complex, woven with threads of blood and brilliance. It is easy to view them simply as destroyers, and indeed, the destruction was apocalyptic. But they were also catalysts. They forced the world to adapt or perish. The Khwarezmian Empire, for all its wealth and pomp, was rigid, divided, and arrogant. It met a force that was fluid, meritocratic, and singularly focused. In the Darwinian struggle of empires, adaptability is the ultimate weapon. When we look back at the Battle of Samarkand, we are looking at the moment when the medieval way of war was rendered obsolete. The feudal levies and heavy static defenses of the Shah could not stand against the mobile total war doctrine of the Khan. It was a lesson written in fee, one that military historians and strategists study to this day. The tactics used, the feigned retreat, the psychological terror, the encirclement, are timeless maneuvers that transcend the era of the bow and the horse. In the end, Samarkand was not just destroyed, it was reset. It would rise again, centuries later, under Tamerlane, who sought to emulate the very conquerors who had raised it. But the Samarkand of 1220, that specific iteration of human achievement, was lost to the sands of time, preserved only in the chronicles of survivors and the archaeological scars left on the earth. It stands as a monument to the terrifying power of the Mongol Empire, a force that came from the nothingness of the horizon to bring the world to its knees. This deep dive into the fall of Persia is not just a recounting of troop movements and casualty figures, it is a study of hubris and nemesis. Shah Muhammad II believed he was untouchable, protected by the buffer of the desert and the walls of his cities. Genghis Khan proved that there are no buffers for those with the will to cross them. The tragedy of Samarkand is the tragedy of the assumption of safety. In the grand theater of history there is no safety, only the temporary pause between storms, and in 1220 the storm was absolute. As the narrative of the Khwarezmian collapse concludes, we are left with the image of the Mongol rear guard riding away from the smoking ruins. The sun sets over the Transoxianan plain, casting long shadows over the broken walls. The empire of the Shah has evaporated like water on a hot stone. The age of the Mongols has begun. It is a story of total war in its purest, most brutal form, a reminder that history is often forged on the anvil of destruction.